Alien Diplomat thought she was untouchable. Until a human put her in her place, the Galactic Council chambers hummed with the low-frequency vibrations of a dozen different species as they prepared for what many considered the most important diplomatic session in centuries. Ambassador Vela of the Corthani Empire adjusted her ceremonial robes with practiced precision, her forearms moving in synchronized patterns that spoke of centuries of refined diplomatic training. The Corthani had dominated galactic politics for over 3 millennia, and Vela had never encountered a species that could match their intellectual superiority or political cunning. The humans were the newest addition to the council, having achieved faster than light travel only 50 years prior. Most species required at least 2 centuries to develop the technological and social sophistication necessary for council membership, but the humans had somehow managed it in record time. Vela found this suspicious and had spent considerable time studying their rapid advancement. Her research had revealed a species that appeared to rely more on emotional reactions and intuitive leaps, rather than the logical, methodical approach that had served the Corthani so well. As the session began, Vela observed the human delegation with barely concealed disdain. Their leader appeared to be a middle-aged man named Ambassador Reed, who carried himself with a confidence that Vela found both amusing and irritating. Unlike the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by other species, the humans dressed in simple dark suits that seemed almost primitive in their plainness. Vela had dealt with countless species over her 2-century career, and she could read beings like an open manuscript. The humans would be no different. The first issue on the agenda involved territorial disputes in the outer rim sectors where human colonies had been established near ancient Corthani trade routes. Vela rose to address the council, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged in diplomatic discourse. She outlined the historical precedents that clearly established Corthani rights to those regions, citing treaties that predated human space travel by millennia. Her argument was flawless from a legal standpoint, and she expected the usual grudging acceptance that lesser species typically displayed when confronted with superior Corthani logic. Ambassador Reed stood to respond, and Vela prepared herself for the stammering protestations that she had heard from so many other species. Instead, the human began to speak in measured tones that immediately caught her attention. He did not challenge the historical precedents she had cited, but instead began to discuss the current reality of the situation. The human colonies were not merely settlements, but thriving communities that had established trade relationships with dozens of species. They had built infrastructure that had actually improved commerce in the region and had created jobs for beings from 17 different worlds. What troubled Vela was not just the content of his response, but the way he delivered it. There was no deference in his tone, no acknowledgement of Corthani's superiority. He spoke as an equal, which was something she had rarely encountered in her lengthy career. More disturbing was the reaction of the other council members, who seemed to be listening to the human with genuine interest, rather than the polite tolerance usually reserved for lesser species. As Reed continued his presentation, Vela realized that he was not simply arguing legal points, but was painting a picture of a future where cooperation could benefit all parties involved. He spoke of technological innovations that human scientists had developed that could revolutionize space travel and manufacturing. He described cultural exchanges that had already begun to enrich the lives of beings across multiple worlds. His words carried a conviction that seemed to resonate with the assembled delegates in a way that centuries of Corthani logical arguments had never achieved. The human concluded his initial statement by proposing a compromise that would allow both species to maintain their interests while expanding opportunities for mutual benefit. Vela found herself in the unusual position of needing to respond to an argument that she had not anticipated. Her careful preparation had focused on legal precedents and historical rights, but the human had shifted the entire framework of the discussion. For the first time in her career, she felt uncertain about how to proceed. During the recess that followed, Vela approached several of her longtime allies among the council members, expecting to find support for her position. Instead, she discovered that many of them were seriously considering the human proposal. The Zentari representative mentioned that human medical technology had already saved thousands of lives on his homeworld. Qualan Delegate spoke of human agricultural techniques that had ended famine on 3 different planets. Even the ancient ethereal collective seemed intrigued by human philosophical concepts that challenged their own understanding of consciousness and existence. When the session resumed, Vela attempted to regain control of the discussion by pointing out the potential dangers of allowing such a young species to gain too much influence too quickly. She cited examples from galactic history where rapid expansion had led to instability and conflict. Her arguments were logical and well supported by historical evidence, but somehow they seemed to fall flat in the face of the human's earlier presentation. Ambassador Reid rose again to address her concerns, and Vela braced herself for what she expected would be an emotional appeal lacking in substantive response. Instead, she found herself listening to a thoughtful analysis of the historical examples she had cited. The human demonstrated a thorough understanding of galactic history that matched her own, but he interpreted the lessons differently. Where she saw the dangers of rapid change, he saw the necessity of adaptation and growth. Where she emphasized stability and established order, he spoke of innovation and progress. What truly unsettled Vela was the realization that the human's arguments were not merely emotional appeals, but were grounded in a sophisticated understanding of political theory and historical precedent. His knowledge of galactic law was impressive, but more importantly, he seemed to understand the underlying principles that gave those laws their power. He was not simply quoting statutes, but was demonstrating how those principles could be applied to create new solutions for contemporary challenges. As the debate continued throughout the day, Vela found herself responding to human arguments rather than setting the agenda, as she had always done before. Reid seemed to anticipate her moves and had prepared responses that addressed her concerns while advancing his own position. This was not the behavior she expected from a species that had barely achieved space travel within living memory. The turning point came when Vela attempted to use her species' most powerful diplomatic weapon, the invocation of historical precedents. This was a formal procedure that allowed a species with sufficient historical standing to essentially override the objections of newer council members. The Korthani had used this privilege only 3 times in their long membership, but each time it had been decisive. Vela was confident that invoking this ancient right would end the human challenge to their authority. Ambassador Reid listened to her formal invocation with what appeared to be respectful attention. When she concluded, he asked for permission to respond, which was granted as a matter of protocol. What followed was not the gracious acceptance that Vela expected, but rather a detailed analysis of the legal and ethical foundations of the invocation itself. Reid argued that while the Korthani had every right to use this privilege, the spirit of the law required that it be used only when newer species lacked the experience or knowledge to make informed decisions. The human then proceeded to demonstrate that his delegation possessed both the knowledge and experience necessary to participate as equals in the council's deliberations. He cited specific examples of human contributions to galactic civilization over the past 50 years. He referenced scientific discoveries that had advanced the understanding of multiple species. He described diplomatic initiatives that had resolved conflicts between older, more established civilizations. His presentation was so thorough and well documented that even Vela's closest allies began to question whether the invocation was appropriate in this situation. For the first time in her career, Vela felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The other council members were not just listening to the human, they were being convinced by his arguments. The Korthani had maintained their dominant position through a combination of historical precedent, technological superiority, and political cunning. But the humans seemed to possess something that her species had never encountered before: an ability to inspire others to see beyond their own immediate interests toward a vision of mutual benefit and shared progress. The session concluded without a formal resolution, but Vela knew that something fundamental had changed. The easy dominance that the Korthani had enjoyed for centuries was being challenged by a species that refused to accept their assigned place in the galactic hierarchy. As she prepared to return to her quarters, Vela realized that she was facing something she had never encountered before: a worthy opponent who might actually be her equal, or perhaps even her superior. In the art of diplomatic discourse, the following morning brought news that would shake the foundations of galactic politics. 3 major trade guilds had announced their intention to support the human proposal for the Outer Rim territories. The Zentari government had formally requested human assistance in developing new medical technologies. Even the Ethereal Collective had extended an invitation for human philosophers to participate in their sacred contemplative gatherings. The momentum was clearly shifting in favor of the human position. Vela spent the morning in emergency consultation with her superiors on the Korthani homeworld. The response was swift and uncompromising. She was instructed to use any means necessary to prevent the humans from gaining additional influence in the council. The Korthani leadership had decided that the human challenge represented an existential threat to their galactic dominance, and they were prepared to take drastic action to preserve their position. When the council reconvened that afternoon, Vela implemented her new strategy. She began by questioning the humans' right to even participate in the discussion, citing obscure regulations that had not been invoked in centuries. She challenged the authenticity of their documentation and demanded independent verification of their claims. She used every procedural tool at her disposal to slow the proceedings and prevent the humans from building on their momentum from the previous day. Ambassador Reid responded to each challenge with patience and professionalism that only made Vela more frustrated. He provided the requested documentation without complaint. He agreed to independent verification of human claims. He even offered to withdraw certain proposals if they were causing unnecessary controversy. His reasonable responses made Vela's aggressive tactics appear petty and obstructionist in comparison. The other council members began to express their displeasure with the Korthani approach. Several delegates pointed out that the humans were being subjected to scrutiny that had never been applied to other species. The Qualan representative formally protested the use of archaic regulations that violated the spirit of council cooperation. Even some of Vela's traditional allies began to distance themselves from her increasingly desperate tactics. As the day progressed, Vela realized that her strategy was backfiring spectacularly. Her attempts to undermine the human position were instead highlighting their reasonableness and diplomatic skill. Every obstacle she placed in their path was overcome with grace and competence that impressed the other council members. She was not just failing to stop the humans, she was inadvertently helping them build support for their position. The crisis reached its peak when Vela made a fatal error in judgment. Frustrated by her inability to shake the human delegation, she decided to issue a direct challenge to Ambassador Reed's competence. She questioned his species' ability to understand the complexities of galactic politics and suggested that humans lacked the intellectual capacity to participate meaningfully in council deliberations. It was a calculated insult designed to provoke an emotional response that would discredit the human position. Reed's response was not what Vela expected. Instead of anger or defensive protests, he simply stood and looked at her with what appeared to be genuine sadness. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that filled the chamber with an almost tangible sense of gravity. He did not respond to her insults or attempt to defend his species' intelligence. Instead, he began to speak about the nature of wisdom and the difference between knowledge and understanding. The human's words cut through Vela's centuries of diplomatic training and political calculation to expose something that she had never been forced to confront before. He spoke of the arrogance that comes from believing oneself superior to others, and the blindness that results from never questioning one's own assumptions. He described the isolation that comes from viewing every interaction as a competition to be won rather than an opportunity for mutual growth and understanding. As Reed continued his quiet but devastating response, Vela realized that she was experiencing something that no Corthani had faced in living memory. She was being intellectually and morally outmaneuvered by a being she had considered inferior. The human was not just defeating her arguments, he was exposing the fundamental flaws in her entire world view. His words carried a weight that came not from centuries of political dominance, but from a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly civilized. The council chamber fell silent as Reed concluded his response. Vela found herself unable to formulate a reply, not because she lacked the words, but because she finally understood the futility of her position. She had spent her entire career believing that diplomatic success came from demonstrating superiority over others, but the human had shown her a different approach based on mutual respect and genuine collaboration. In that moment of silence, Vela experienced something that would change her forever. For the first time in her long career, she felt humbled by another being's wisdom. The human had not defeated her through superior force or political cunning, but through a demonstration of character that left her own petty ambitions exposed as exactly what they were. She had been so focused on maintaining her species' dominance that she had forgotten the true purpose of diplomacy, which was to create a better future for all beings. When the council session concluded that day, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The human proposal was approved by an overwhelming margin, with only the Corthani delegation dissenting. But more importantly, the balance of power in galactic politics had shifted permanently. The humans had demonstrated that they were not just another species seeking a place at the table, but were potential leaders who could inspire others to reach for something better than what they had always known. Vela returned to her quarters that evening, facing the most difficult decision of her career. She could file a report with her superiors that blamed her failure on human trickery or political manipulation. She could recommend that the Corthani Empire take more aggressive action to counter the human threat. Or she could do something that no Corthani diplomat had ever done before she could admit that her species had been wrong about their own superiority, and that they had something to learn from these remarkable humans. The choice she made that night would not only determine her own future, but would set the course for a new era in galactic civilization. As she composed her report to the Corthani leadership, Vela realized that she had been given a rare gift, the opportunity to be part of something greater than her own species' ambitions. The humans had shown her that true strength came not from dominating others, but from inspiring them to be better than they ever thought possible. The final message that Vela transmitted to her homeworld was unlike anything the Korthani government had ever received from one of their diplomats. She recommended that her species abandon their attempts to maintain dominance through political manipulation and instead embrace the human approach of building consensus through genuine cooperation. She suggested that the Korthani had much to learn from these remarkable beings, who had achieved in 50 years what most species required centuries to accomplish. The response from the Korthani leadership was swift and predictable. Vela was stripped of her diplomatic credentials and recalled to face charges of treason and incompetence. But by then it no longer mattered what her superiors thought. She had discovered something more valuable than political power or species superiority. She had found the courage to acknowledge that there was always room for growth, and that true wisdom came from recognizing the worth in others regardless of their origins or background. The story of Vela's transformation spread quickly through diplomatic circles and beyond. Within months, other species began to reevaluate their own assumptions about human capabilities and potential. The rigid hierarchies that had governed galactic politics for millennia began to give way to more collaborative approaches that emphasized mutual benefit over dominance. The humans had not just won a political victory, they had fundamentally changed the way that civilized beings interacted with each other. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they would mark it as the beginning of the Second Galactic Renaissance, a time when cooperation replaced competition as the driving force of interstellar civilization. And at the center of this transformation was the recognition that true leadership came not from those who claimed superiority over others, but from those who had the wisdom to treat all beings with dignity and respect, regardless of their perceived status or capabilities.